I went out to the marsh for the first time, and I realized what a very unique ecosystem it was. When you have to wear boots that start at your knees and boots that go to your hips and then boots that go to your chest, and you have to learn how to drive a boat just to go out and check your cattle, and then it's very different from where I was raised and where I worked. So it's quite unique.
When you bring upland cattle from what we call upland is anywhere other than the marsh. It can be 10 miles sometime, it can be 40 miles. But when you bring upland cattle down into the marsh environment, there are some problems that occur. These upland animals are not accustomed to going out into the water and into these really mucky soils. They sink sometimes a foot deep, and then there's half a foot of water on top of that to harvest the forage. And these animals that are raised in these upland dry situations, they have trouble adapting to the marsh sometimes. Years ago, when the marshes were grazed, it was kind of an open range, and to some extent it's still that way. You have 3 or 4 or 5 family members or non-relatives that run the cattle together in big herds. And traditionally, for example, in the Hackberry Grand Chenier area, there were some large tracts of marshland, and they would turn out sometimes 1,000, 1,500 head of cattle, say October during the year. And these cattle distributed themselves pretty well throughout the marsh areas. And they grouped up in small groups, you know, maybe 20 or 50 head of cattle. And a lot of that had to do with where the cattle came from. If they were my cattle, maybe they stayed in a group because they were accustomed to being together. And if they were my cousin's cattle, they stayed together in the group and so on. And they kind of each went along, dispersed themselves throughout the marsh. And you ended up with bunches of cattle in different places in that marsh. And these cattle had their calves there during the spring. And then they were taken to the uplands during the summer. And then when the heifer was old enough to be put into production, she was put with the herd out with the bull, and she returned to the same spot and had her calf, and the cycle went on and on and on. And now we're coming along and trying to improve the grazing conditions and the habitat conditions by going to some controlled grazing systems where we go to a 2-pasture, a 3-pasture, a 4-pasture type situation in these same grazed marsh areas. And some of the things that are challenges to us as managers in trying to get these systems put into place has been that these cattle, or these cattle that have been raised down here in these certain areas in certain groups for generation after generation. And one of the problems is when we do put up a fence, construct a unit, and we attempt to move the animals into a grazing area, and we intend for them to stay in that area, they have adequate nutrition, they have clean water, they have everything that's needed. They still attempt to get back to these sites where they were born, where they were raised, and it's an ongoing struggle to keep the animals in the unit that we intend them to be in.
We got them to put the animals into one herd and rotate the animals through different units as one herd. And what I found that completely different from what I thought would happen was that once the animals were put in one herd and they grazed an area and were going to be moved to another location where the grass was going to be greener and more palatable, that they all would be very anxious to go. And what I found that happened was that the animals, once you moved them, they would actually jump into the canals, swim the canals to go back to the location they had always grazed at. So once we put the fence up, where the animals could not swim the canals, I received a phone call from the wildlife biologist and said, you need to come down here and see this. And what I found was there was about 20 animals that stood at the fence and just bellowed the entire time and refused to eat, refused to move from the fence unless they were in the location they were used to. They were raised in that spot. That's how they know to graze. They're not familiar with an area, and if they're not familiar with it, they won't put their head down and start grazing like most cows. They'll walk up and down the ridges until something looks familiar to them.